Welcome to the Trauma Overhaul Podcast. Just a quick disclaimer that the content contained in this episode is not to be a substitute for any mental health service by a licensed provider. Some of the content may also be sensitive in nature and it can be triggering to some of our audiences. Welcome to the Trauma Overhaul Podcast. I am your host, Tiffany Singleton, and I am so excited to have Dr. Janina Fisher with us this evening. Hi,
Thank
Dr. Fisher.
you.
Yes.
Yes, I love your title, Trauma Overhaul.
Yes, ma'am. Let's see, we can overhaul it and get back to some healthy ways of living.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. So we have Dr. Fisher with us today, and we'll be talking about how to treat trauma by healing fragmented selves of trauma survivors. So I'm going to begin by letting you introduce yourself. Who is Dr. Janina Fisher?
Well, I'm a psychologist who became inspired to work with trauma in 1989. So that tells you how old I am.
Right. That's a long time.
That's a long time ago. And I was inspired by listening to Dr. Judy Herman speak to an audience of medical and mental health professionals. And she said, doesn't it make sense that people suffer because of real events that have happened to them rather than because of their, some mental problem? And I thought, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. People suffer because real things have happened to them, not because they're mentally ill.
Correct.
And so that inspired me to pursue trauma as my specialty. Because back in 1989, nobody was talking about trauma.
Right.
It was a brand new topic. Mm-hmm. And we had to convince people that real things really did happen to people that were overwhelming and traumatic and left their lasting mark.
Absolutely. So let's begin by, because I don't ever like to assume that everybody knows what trauma is. So let's talk a little bit about what trauma is and how it's like the buzzword now and it's being overextended.
Yes, it's driving me crazy, to be honest.
Okay.
Because we fought very hard to have trauma taken seriously. In 1989, people did not think child abuse was traumatic.
Wow.
The only things that were accepted as traumatic were war and sexual assault.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
And other than that, domestic violence, child abuse, racial trauma, none of that was considered traumatic. Mm-hmm. And so we fought hard to have trauma recognized. And the definition of trauma that I've always used is, it's either one event, series of events, or in a whole environment, a set of conditions. Like war is a set of conditions. Domestic violence, it's like, in war, you could have 100 traumatic events.
Right.
In child abuse or domestic violence, you can have hundreds of events. Racial trauma, hundreds of events. So it's not. So what I became interested in is, how do traumatic environments affect people? Mm-hmm. And the other requirement is there's an event, and that event has to be overwhelming.
Overwhelming, right.
And convey a sense of threat to the person's life. Now, we could say, well, looking back on it, nobody was going to get killed. But the subjective feeling in the moment is, I will not survive this.
Wow.
So now, of late, people are talking about, my boss traumatized me
Mm.
when he gave me that, humiliating performance review. Again, very painful. I don't want to understate what it's like to be humiliated or criticized by an authority figure, or what it's like to have a partner or spouse who puts you down, or parents who are cold and critical. But those aren't traumatic. They're very distressing,
Right.
but they're not traumatic.
Correct.
So traumatic has to involve some element of threat and fear.
Right. And so there are some persons that might say, well, so and so has been dealing with that for years. I just don't understand why they just can't let it go. Like, why can't they just get over it? So we know now that trauma is housed and trapped in the body.
Right. We can't get rid of it without removing large parts of our brains.
Correct.
So, which is not, I don't recommend.
Right.
Right. So what we learned in the 1990s, when we started, well, not me, but when the scientists started studying the brains of trauma survivors, we discovered that the way the brain responds to normal life actually changes as a result of trauma. And one of the most interesting new pieces of research says that children who are traumatized develop brains that are either overreactive or underreactive to future stress. And trauma survivors know what that's like, right? They either go numb or they freak out.
Right.
And neither is a pleasant experience. And it's especially hard because the most triggering thing when you've been traumatized is other human beings.
Right.
Which is so tragic, right? That the legacy of trauma means that the people you feel closest to or depend on for support become the most powerful triggers.
Right. Okay. So in addressing this at the body level, what is your understanding, or what has been the best approach for you in treating trauma at the body level?
Well, there are, there are somatic approaches to trauma. And I was trained in one of them, which is sensory motor psychotherapy. But the difficulty is, for a lot of trauma survivors, the body feels like a very unsafe place. And so, it made sense theoretically to work with the body, based on Bessel van der Kolk's idea that the body keeps the score. Yes. But actually working with the body is more complicated. And so I developed this approach that I wrote about in Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors that addresses both the brain and the body. I mean, both the brain and the emotional issues. There's another piece to it. So the other thing that really spoke to me was a theory that is very well known in Europe called the structural dissociation theory, which basically says that in order to survive trauma, you have to dissociate, you have to fragment in order to get some distance from the experiences that are overwhelming. Okay. And again, one overwhelming experience wouldn't necessarily cause someone to fragment, but when it's an environment day in, day out, and you have to survive in it, right, then fragmenting becomes really smart.
Mm.
And the theory rests on the idea that the brain is fragmented. So we call it the brain, but in fact, the brain consists of different structures that speak to each other through neural networks.
Right.
And so we have a brain that's very, very skilled at fragmenting when we need to. And I think we all know that from, children, partners, when you want to kill them, and yet you're able to be rational and, and even caring.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because the part of you that wants to kill them, you kind of park and you try to deal with the people you love with your wisest mind.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I started to use this theory probably 25 years ago, and to start talking to people about the part of them that was angry, the part of them that was numb, the part of them that felt hopeless and ashamed, the part that wanted to die, the part that wanted to give up, the part that was desperate for someone to love and care.
Right.
And I found that was a language that people kind of intuitively understood. And so they didn't understand, where in your body do you feel this, but they understood what part of you feels this. And it's a way, it's actually what it does is it gives us a way to use this part of the brain, which is the kind of awareness part of the brain, instead of this part of the brain, which is the reactive part of the brain. Mm-hmm. And so in this model, I teach people to notice overwhelming feelings as communications from parts.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, and what that does, I'm just thinking of a couple of my clients who are good examples of this. One I was just talking to this morning about, she has a perfectionistic part that gets wrapped up in trying to do everything right. And of course, overwhelming not only other parts, but overwhelming her husband, her children, overwhelming herself.
Right.
And she was saying it's so weird because her husband could be saying, just relax, stand away from the computer, stop trying to clean everything for the third time.
Right.
and she says, I can't. When that part takes over, I am going to work my fingers to the bone until everything is just right.
Right.
And it's kind of like, and she realized that part of her actually had to do that as a child too. Because her greatest safety was doing everything for her parents that she could to keep them calm. That's right. and less angry and abusive. And if she did anything wrong, you can just imagine the punishment.
Right. Right. So so what I'm hearing is, even in dealing with treating trauma, dealing with that inner child also is really, really critical.
Right. Exactly. And often it's many children that she has very young, hurt, sad and lonely parts.
Wow.
And then she has what I call protector parts who try to distract from that hurt and pain, who try to help her survive in all the ways she needed to survive as a kid.
Wow.
Yeah.
And being able to identify that leads to healing, right? Because a lot of times we don't realize that a lot of stuff is still deeply rooted in childhood issues. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because when we get triggered, it's a feeling. It isn't a memory. And this is one of my pet peeves about the trauma field, is that we've been focused on events. And it makes me crazy because it's, I've been working with people for now 42 years. I've been in practice.
Almost as long as I've been living.
Right. And I never have people come in saying, I'm having a problem with memories.
Right.
They come in saying, I'm depressed. My marriage is falling apart.
Right.
I can't concentrate at work. They don't come in saying, I'm remembering too much.
Right. Ooh, so that leads me to my next question, because many feel that they avoid therapy because they feel like you have to relive the experience.
Right.
But we do not.
That's absolutely right. And it's important to have that conversation up front with a therapist or counselor, right? Because many therapists still believe that the road to recovery is through remembering. And it's not, because the problem is not what happened to us, but the problem is the imprint it's left.
That's right.
It's the legacy.
That's absolutely correct. So when we are dealing with, how do you reintegrate all of the different fragmented pieces? What does that look like from a therapeutic standpoint?
What it looks like from a therapeutic standpoint is, how can I put it? It's basically being able to offer these parts a reparative experience that helps to resolve the trauma. So for my client's sad and lonely child part, my hope is that she'll be able to develop a very loving relationship with that part, so the part doesn't feel the sadness and loneliness forever and ever and ever. Right. With angry parts, a reparative experience they often need is simply being respected and acknowledged. Because angry parts really get triggered by unfairness. They get triggered by people who have no boundaries, or whose boundaries are bad.
Right.
And so those angry parts don't need to just vent. They need respect from the individual. They need to be thanked for their courage and strength.
Yeah, those are very good examples. Now, in this process, is there any type of deep cognitive restructuring or reframing that has to take place during any of those phases?
Well, really, the whole model is cognitive restructuring. Because when you take I'm thinking of a different client who, when I first met her, I met her years ago. I've only been her therapist for a short time, but I originally met her years and years ago.
Mhm.
And she was very depressed and very suicidal,
Mm.
and also very angry.
Mhm.
So her anger pushed away everybody. Um, her which made her depressed part more depressed, which made her suicidal part more suicidal.
Got it. Mhm.
And for her, it was a cognitive restructuring from I'm suicidal. When I met her, her previous therapist brought her to my office
Mhm.
because he felt worried about, I mean, he was scared that she was actually going to kill herself. And I remember the first thing she said to me is, I'm going to die November 9th.
Wow. Wow.
So that,
Wow.
and, and so I taught her, and the person I referred her to taught her to understand the suicidal feelings as a suicidal part. So the cognitive restructuring went from I'm suicidal, I want to die, to there's a part of me
Mm.
that wants to kill me
Mhm.
rather than have me suffer.
I love it. Mhm.
Yeah. And today the suicidal part might be active maybe 10 days out of a year,
Wow.
as opposed to the suicidal part was threatening 360 days.
65. Yeah, I was going to say a daily. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a huge, that cognitive restructuring is really, really important,
Mm.
right? And understanding the loss of hope as a hopeless part,
Right.
right? Rather than being governed by the belief there is no hope,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
Carrying the belief, when I feel hopeless, that's my hopeless part tapping me on the shoulder.
Right. Wow. That's a great example. Great
Yeah.
example. I'm just curious because I know in with CPT on the cognitive processing, we deal a lot with those stuck points, which deals with a lot of cognitive restructuring.
Yeah.
So, do you find that you have to work a lot with those stuck points or those negative distorted beliefs in the somatic process? Is it combined, or what do you typically look at when it comes to that?
Well, usually, I mean, it takes a lot of practice,
Okay.
because if you think about the kind of the trauma related cognitive schemas that
Right.
people have got ingrained in their brains through daily repetition,
Hmm.
right? And so it takes a lot of repetition to change those beliefs and restructure that thought pattern. So I really emphasize that it takes practicing in therapy, practicing outside of
Outside.
therapy, right? And so what I've been doing, thanks to Zoom, I
Hmm.
would, the pandemic taught me this, is I've been making 2 or 3 minute Zoom videos for people,
Okay.
right? Where they they have a little video in which I say, if you're feeling hopeless,
Mm.
remember that's the hopeless part. Notice what the hopeless part is telling you.
Mm.
She feels hopeless,
Ooh.
right?
Hmm.
And when you say, I feel hopeless, you abandon her. It's like saying to a little kid, yeah, it is hopeless. You
Mm.
should be hopeless.
Wow.
And so I basically model in those videos how to take those negative thoughts and reframe them as parts.
Wow. I love it.
Yeah. And it's really been working because clients will watch the videos a lot
Right,
because the sound of our voices, our facial expressions are calming for them
right.
and
Wow.
reassuring.
Right. And you sound like you have them short and succinct and to the point.
Well, yes, because I could go on for 10 minutes, but I don't think anybody would watch.
Yeah. It's a grab and go. That's a win-win.
Yeah, exactly. The grab and go theory of psychotherapy. Love it.
That is. Well, you have been doing an incredible work. Maybe a couple of years ago, I came across you, and I have been following you ever since. I've been taking courses through PESI, and I was just like, I have got to meet her.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, we
Yeah.
we appreciate your knowledge, your wisdom, and sharing that with the world.
Well, it has been my pleasure. That's been my mission
Mhm.
in my work and life, and I'm so glad.
Yes. Okay, so I have one final question for you. So, how has the conversation around mental health evolved during your lifetime, and where do you see it heading in the future?
Oh, wow.
That's kind of loaded, right?
I mean, especially in today's political climate. I mean, I think overall,
Mhm.
we've overcome a lot of the stereotypes about therapy. But there's a new stereotype, which also I have a hard time with, which is,
Mhm.
you know, because the political conversation is, oh, send all the mentally ill people to therapy, then they won't shoot other people,
Wow.
which is so crazy.
Right.
Right? Because therapists are not miracle workers.
Correct.
Right? So let's make mental health treatment more acceptable. I mean, compared to where society was about mental health treatment 40 years ago,
Mhm.
it's been amazing because more and more there is an acceptance of therapy. But I think the stigma is still there that if you go to therapy, you're weak or you're crazy. And so we still have some work to do to make it like going to the doctor
Right.
to have a checkup.
Right. Right. And that's what amazes me because I'm like, when you have heart problems, you go to the heart doctor.
Right. You don't think about
Right. So if
it.
we have problems here, what's the problem with going to see someone about that, right?
Right. And maybe it would be helpful if we said when people have problems with their emotional hearts, right?
Ooh,
As if we have a problem with the physical heart, we're on the phone getting to the doctor.
yes,
If we have a problem with the emotional heart, we're supposed to kind of stiff upper lip it.
correct. Right. Yeah. So I am glad that more people are embracing it now, but I totally still see what you're saying. Because there are a lot of different organizations, even I hate to say it, but a lot of church and faith-based organizations are still saying, hey, let's just pray about it. You don't have to go to a therapist, right? But then on the flip side, there are a lot of faith-based organizations that are now promoting it and seeing that it's a great marriage with mental health and faith that works perfectly.
Absolutely. That's what I was going to say. Hey, let's kind of double our money here.
That's right. Yes.
And
Let's marry it.
I have to give credit where credit is due because there's a big subset in the Christian counseling
Mhm.
world that is trauma focused. So there's really been an effort in the Christian counseling world to be more knowledgeable about therapy.
Yeah.
So hopefully the two can go together. I don't know if politics and mental health can ever go together. That really sounds good.
Right. We'll just have to wait and see, right?
Right, exactly.
But
Yeah.
it's doing the sort of a shift, so we'll just be hopeful.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, we'll be hopeful. Well, I know that you've had a long day, so I am not going to hold you any longer. I am so, so grateful that you took this time out of your busy schedule to join me on this podcast. And I know that this is going to be a blessing to the audience. And in closing, what would you want to say to someone who has been experiencing trauma and is looking for that freedom that they desire?
Well, I would tell them to keep listening to the podcast
Yeah.
and really gaining strength and confidence from knowing that they're part of a large worldwide community,
Right.
right? And that they have more in common with all of the people who've been through similar experiences.
Mhm.
And that trauma, people ask me sometimes, isn't it depressing working with trauma? And I say, no, on the contrary,
Mhm.
because trauma can be healed,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
Right. As you say, overhauled.
Yes. Overhaul. Let's root it up. Let's throw it out and let's start over.
Yes. Right. Right. So thank you so much for inviting me on.
Yes, ma'am. I appreciate it. I enjoy this, and I really hope to be able to meet you in person one day.
I hope so too.
So I'll be looking to see when you have a conference, so you'll be at a conference.
Okay.
I can meet you. And tell us if someone wants to connect with you, could you let us know what your website and your handles are?
Sure. I don't know that I have handles because I'm too old to be social media
Okay.
savvy. I know I have a Facebook page. I know that.
Okay.
And they can probably find me on Instagram. I have no idea how.
Okay.
But my website is janinafisher.com.
There you go. Okay. And I'm sure if you would go to her website, you'd be able to connect with her and locate her on all the platforms. And she has videos on YouTube.
Yes. Yeah. And I believe there are videos that are going to be available on my website too.
Awesome. Awesome. Look, well, I would definitely be looking.
Okay, great.
For new content. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It has been an absolute pleasure. And I know that what you've shared is going to be a blessing to others. And I hope you have an awesome, awesome evening.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. All right. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.